Okay, hello and welcome back to Reason is Evidence and the Armchair Philosophy. Now we are going to dive in and look at my argument about why there is no such thing as truth apart from human existence. And of course, I concede that the individual is the root of humanity, that the individual is the only human who is actual. There is no such thing as a collective of humans. So when I refer to man, understand that I mean individual human beings, men and women. Let me just check something here. Yeah, still going okay. All right. There we go. So the title of this essay is, that I wrote back in June, I suppose, not that that matters, it's irrelevant. It's called, "If the Truth is True Without Man's Existence, Then Man Cannot Claim to Know Truth at All." And it begins thus: "If truth, the universal composition of all that man declares true," meaning truth as in capital T-R-U-T-H, "if truth does not require my existence in order to be true, then it is quite impossible for me to declare that it is true at all. My observations, my thoughts concerning it, my concession of its axiom, all of these things are entirely irrelevant. Thus, if my existence presents an absolutely irrelevant component to the reality of truth, that is, it is true regardless of whether I'm around to observe it or not, then I am always and perpetually operating from a place of irrelevance with respect to the truth. There is literally and absolutely nothing which is an extension of me which offers anything of any meaning or worth to truth, which makes it impossible for me, being inexorably me or absolutely me." Let me just check something here. I'm having a little problem here. Okay, we're still good. Sorry about that, guys. Just what's going on here. Here we go. There is literally and absolutely nothing which is an extension of me, which offers anything of any meaning or worth to truth, which makes it impossible for me, being inexorably me, absolutely outside of truth, to even acknowledge that truth is true at all. It is beyond my observation, because the sum total of my observation, being a direct function of me, which again is absolutely outside of truth, is irrelevance. Period. I, in other words, due to my abject and utter irrelevance, am antithetical to truth, perpetually and wholly outside of it. I represent nothing less than a categorical affront to the truth, which not only does not need me to be true, but finds that my existence poses a contradiction, an insufferable limitation to its absoluteness and its absolutely true existence. Further, if we say that truth is absolutely true regardless of whether I exist or not, which is what absolutely true means, then we have in fact posited a contradiction in terms. If I concede that I do exist, and if I concede that truth is absolutely true outside of me, then my existence is not actually irrelevant. My existence, again conceding that I do in fact exist, must represent a limitation to the absolute trueness of the truth. And thus, with my existence established, the truth can no longer be absolutely true, it is only relatively true. Relative to what? Relative to its position with respect to me, which makes my existence an integral and utterly defining component of truth. Instead of being absolutely true without me, its trueness depends on my existence to give it meaning at any given moment. It cannot and does not operate in a vacuum. I exist, and therefore I am a boundary to its truth, a boundary it must include and reconcile when defining the terms of its truth. And since, between truth and myself, I am the only one who is consciously aware of truth, for truth is not a self-aware agent, but purely a concept in this paradigm, the responsibility falls to me to utilize truth, to declare it, in service to the only frame of reference I have for truth, my own existence. For man and truth cannot exist in tension as absolute forms in and of themselves. One must subjugate the other to its singular frame of reference, itself. So, see what I'm saying is, if we say truth is absolutely true outside of man, meaning my individual existence is irrelevant for truth to be true. I can die tomorrow. I could have never been born. I can fall into the black sea of nothingness, and truth still remains absolutely true. What is true, based on however you define it, usually the laws of nature are how, anytime we talk about a truth that's outside of humanity, it's always determinative truth. It's always a truth based on processes man observes in nature. So the thinking is that these processes somehow continue regardless of whether the individual is there or not. So whether I exist or you exist, whether we are awake and aware, whether we are in the blankness of unconsciousness or death, this absolute truth, the way that the universe continues to work, is still absolutely true. So I say that truth is absolutely true. Of course, when you attempt to integrate a self-aware agent, when you attempt to integrate an individual who's aware of self into the deterministic absolute truth of natural law processes, or things that we say constitute truth, the processes of natural law, which are determinative and absolute. Once you try to integrate awareness into that paradigm, you get a contradiction in terms. You have absolute truth on the one hand, and yet you have a independent, distinct, self-aware agent on the other hand. They're a contradiction in terms. You can't have something be absolutely true and include an agent outside of that truth. If it's absolutely true, it's infinitely true. The individual then represents an affront to its trueness, meaning it is no longer absolutely true, it's relatively true, because we've included a self-aware agent whose consciousness is not bound by the processes of that truth. So, like I said, I exist, and therefore I'm a boundary to its truth, a boundary it must include and reconcile when defining the terms of its truth. And since between truth and myself, I'm the only one who is consciously aware of truth, for truth is not a self-aware agent, but purely a concept in this paradigm, the responsibility falls to me to utilize truth, to declare it in service to the only frame of reference I have for truth, my own existence. Okay, for man and truth cannot exist in tension as absolute forms in and of themselves. One must subjugate the other to its singular frame of reference, itself. Otherwise, an insurmountable and perpetual contradiction arises, whereby man and truth are constantly at war with each other. As soon as man declares the truth true outside of his self, then that truth demands his submission, leading to non-existence as the logical conclusion of that which hinders the absolute truth from being in fact absolutely true, which of course is man's life. If you want to claim this is absolute truth, man is brought into the picture as an independent self-aware agent, you have this contradiction. If you want to continue to declare this absolute truth, then you must concede that man has to essentially die or be removed from the existential equation in order that absolute truth can remain absolutely true. This is why anybody who proposes a standard of truth outside the individual human existence is fundamentally going to concede that tyranny and mysticism are in fact the way that we should govern our lives. If truth is utterly outside of man, man must then be perpetually sacrificed to that truth. And this is why I say atheism, which really roots itself in the idea that the determinative laws of nature are the source of reality, is really the exact same brand of mysticism as the religious mysticism, which says that God is in control of all things. So you have God in control of all things on the one hand, you have the laws of nature in control on the other hand. These are the absolute truths outside of man. They both represent identical primary consciousnesses with just different names. So in order for man to be good, in order for man to be true, Man has to integrate himself into the primary consciousness, either God's sovereign determinative will or the determinative, inexorable laws of nature that the atheists preach. In both cases, the sacrifice of man is required. This is why I reject both atheism and Platonist and Augustinian forms of religion. I would include Christianity, and I am a Christian, but I reject the fundamental assumptions which undergird orthodox interpretation. But anyway, that's why I say atheism and religion, or Platonist religion, are basically two sides of the exact same irrational coin. They're both mysticism, and they both demand that human beings sacrifice themselves to the determinative laws that exist outside of him, the truth that is outside of man. Okay. But if man declares himself the categorical reference point of truth, the standard of truth, which I wholly affirm he is, as the only rational conclusion, then truth must be completely submitted to him, to his life, and must itself instead be rendered non-existent. Not that I'm proclaiming that existence of man means the death of truth. On the contrary, I proclaim that truth is a concept derived from man's brain. It is not actual. Thus, it never actually existed as such in the first place, but it is a cognitive invention of man's astonishing brain, rooted in his ability to simultaneously observe self juxtaposed to what is not self. So truth is a concept that man uses. What is true is a concept that is seen to affirm and perpetuate the individual's life. What is seen and what is called false are ideas that are seen to not perpetuate and affirm man's life. So trueness and falseness are concepts. They are not actualities in and of themselves. We say what is true and what is not based on the frame of reference of our own individual selves, conceding concepts between us, so that we can work together for the efficacious promotion of our mutual existence. That is truth. Truth is not a natural law or a will of God that exists somehow outside of man in the ether, that somehow exists absolutely true even if no human being existed. There's no logic to that, because without human life, what is true becomes, without individual human life, what is true becomes fundamentally irrelevant. If there's no one to know it's true, it can't be said to be true. Okay? This is the power of man to observe self and not self. This is the power of his unique consciousness combined with his senses. Truth doesn't die in service to man, as though man's existence destroys truth, and thus man represents an inexorable and subversive, read totally depraved if you're a Christian, an Orthodox Christian, represents so truth doesn't die in service to man, as though man's existence destroys truth, and thus man represents an inexorable and subversive presence to all that is true and by extension good. Rather, truth never actually exists at all, in so many words, as though it were some kind of objective force beyond man's mind and singularity of self. Not in the least. This is the perspective of the demonstrably wicked and destructive collectivist ideologies, which would be Calvinism, Islamic terrorism, Marxism, socialism, fascism, Neo-Reformation Protestantism, and Catholicism, and their oceans of blood upon which the history of the world has sailed since practically the beginning of time. I am arguing that truth doesn't exist outside of man, but rather that man's life is the source and standard of it. In short, without man's life, the truth does not get to be true. And thus, by logical extrapolation, if the truth is declared true outside of man, absolutely, then man never gets to be man. And thus, if we declare man wholly irrelevant to truth, meaning that truth exists absolutely in spite of his life, then what we are really saying is that man must be dead, must be non-actual for the truth to be absolutely true in order, that its infinite boundaries are not limited by man's existence. Again, going back to the idea that if you insert a completely independent, distinct, autonomous free will agent into the realm of absolute truth, you have created a contradiction, an insurmountable paradox. Either the self-aware agent gets to either the self-aware agent gets to define truth, or the truth gets to define the self. So either truth is a direct function of the self-aware agent, or the agent is a direct function of self-aware truth. There can be no compatible existence with an absolute truth, which is infinite, and a distinct self-aware agent. You can't have infinity coupled with something else by definition. So that's the point. If you bring in a self-aware agent and you try to integrate that agent into absolute truth, it doesn't work. And this is why when you debate atheists and when you argue with other mystics like that, they inevitably have to punt their contradictions into the cosmic abyss of mystery. Because they really have no way of saying there's an absolute determinative truth that we all must adhere to, and that's why science and reason and evidence are the basis for understanding, and God doesn't exist and all that. They can't say there's this absolute truth that exists that governs everything, and yet at the same time incorporate their ability to be a free agent within that existential construct. Okay, if a free self-aware agent is actually truly free and self-aware, then there are no external processes which govern his mind. His mind is an absolute singularity, which means truth is a function of it. And this is why I say atheists are mystics. And this is why atheists never like to debate this point. They never like to talk about the implicit determinism in their worldview, because they understand, or at least they should, that this kind of determinism is the exact same kind of nonsensical determinism that they rail against in their arguments against God. It's the exact same fundamental assumption with a different name. It's just another form of Platonism. Orthodox Christianity and atheism are just different flavors of the same brand of Platonist philosophy, which says that what is material is ultimately submitted to what is the ethereal, what is the great ether of the primary consciousness, which governs and rules everything. We are total depravity. We must be sacrificed to the greater laws of the universe. It's the same thing. So, thus, in order for truth to be true outside of man, it cannot be conceded that man gets to exist at all, so that he cannot present an affront to absolute truth. And if you don't exist, then you don't get to affirm that truth is actually true. In other words, either man's life must be the standard of truth, that which defines what things are true and what things are a lie, which things are good and which things are evil, or man is dead. Though he wakes, he is death walking. He is non-existence incarnate. Thus, it isn't that the plague of collectivist ideologies like Calvinism, Neo-Reformation theology, atheism, etc., murder and exploit the living. It is that they do not recognize that the living are in fact alive at all. You are an extension of the truth outside of you. Thus, whatever happens to you, be it your death, or suffering, or injustice, or abuse, or the theft of your property, it is always in service to truth. You may claim no ownership of your life, because your life is a figment of fantasy. It is the great lie of Satan that you are actually alive, and therefore entitled to justice and consideration commensurate to your status as an absolute, sentient child of God. Your belief in yourself as actual is the singular source of all the evil which exists in the world. And indeed, spend a couple of Sundays in a typical Protestant church, and you will observe this message firsthand, and it will be couched in the most sanctimonious, sage, pensive, and reverent of terms, very like how Stefan Molyneux and other atheists couch their atheism. It's always couched in sage, pensive, reverent terms of morality and love and not killing and not murdering. Let me tell you, atheism must inevitably result in the same kind of bloodshed and mass murder as any other kind of Platonist philosophy, any other kind of determinist philosophy. It is essential that man be destroyed in service to the truth, if that's your belief. And it is going to be presented as just very loving and very non-aggressive, and we all just get along. It will never work out that way, because the fundamental metaphysical assumptions, the existential assumptions one must hold about man to be an atheist, essentially destroy man's ability as a moral creature. It destroys man's credibility as a moral creature, and he must be compelled into truth. And the compelling will be done by those who have the biggest gun. So don't let them fool you. But once you train your vision to observe beyond the propaganda, you can clearly see that the terror you feel is entirely appropriate, that the message you hear is nothing more than God hates people, or the laws of nature hate people, and people will be sacrificed into submission by his ecclesiastical proxies or burned alive for eternity in a lake of fire for being born. The truth which is outside of us and doesn't require existence or the context of ourselves, which is our perpetual reference point, indeed cannot recognize us, and neither can we recognize it. And if we pretend that it can and it does, then affirming that it indeed is absolutely true outside of us demands our removal from reality. It demands our death, the eradication of that which sabotages its truth, and we are obligated to acquiesce to this demand. We have agreed that the truth is true regardless of our existence, and thus we have tacitly agreed that we offer it nothing except an unacceptable boundary to its perfect truthfulness outside of ourselves. Our existence trespasses upon its domain, which being absolutely true is everything. If everything which is said to exist exists in the presence of an absolute truth, then it follows that everything is a direct extension of absolute truth, and therefore we meddling humans, we meddling self-aware agents, must forfeit any claim to self we might like to believe exists autonomously. To assume that we are, that man is, and therefore has his own self, is to blaspheme truth, which does not need us, and indeed must obliterate us if it is indeed to be an absolute, unlimited, categorically objective truth, that is, a non-relative, infinite objective truth. Of course, the problem this poses for truth and those who proclaim truth outside of man, those who peddle the wares of determinist and causal natural law, be it the mystics of today's Orthodox Christianity or the many purveyors of the causal powers of sciences, laws of the universe, which govern. Remember, laws govern. They don't describe. Laws are discovered. So laws govern. They don't just natural law. Laws of physics govern. They don't describe. And they are discovered, not invented. And that's telltale. You will never hear a scientist or physicist talk about a law of nature as descriptive. It is always as causal. And you will never hear them talk about a law of nature which they have invented or created and turned into a mathematical proof. You will only hear them talk about it as something they discovered, as though they're discovering the lost city of Atlantis or a new comet. Like it's some thing, like a law is something that can actually be observed. Now notice, laws of nature can never be themselves observed. They are only observed via the relative movement of objects. So it is wholly irrational to declare that laws of physics govern. Laws of physics are a function of the objects we observe. You take away the objects, you can no longer observe laws of physics. You cannot observe the speed of light without light. You cannot observe gravity without two objects integrated, without two objects functioning in a proximity to one another in space. You take away objects, you take away an object. Red doesn't exist, blue doesn't exist, up doesn't exist, down doesn't exist, left, right, speed, temperature, none of these things exist if you take the object away. So any law pertaining to these ideas is a function of objects. If you take the tangible material objects out of the equation, then laws are irrelevant, which means they have no meaning, which means they're not laws. Okay? Of course, the problem this poses for truth and those who proclaim truth outside of man is the immutability of consciousness. So the problem this poses is the immutability of consciousness, the obvious ipso facto prerequisite of consciousness for any of this to mean anything. Consciousness. In order for any of what we believe to be relevant, for anything an atheist might believe, or a scientist, or anybody else to believe is actually true, demands a self-aware agent to know it. If you are a function of the law, then you're not really you. Whatever you claim to know is not really knowledge. It's merely an extension of the determinative force outside of you. So the problem is in order to say we're all governed by the laws of nature, you need to be conscious of yourself, and you need to be conscious of nature. But of course, if you concede that everything's determined by laws, consciousness can't possibly exist. That's the problem. So consciousness, you are perpetually you. You are the objective prerequisite of the existence of anything else not you. For if something cannot be observed by you to exist to you, for something cannot be observed by you to exist to you, that is, relevant to you, meaning providing the environment necessary for you to know the difference between what is you and what is not you, then you cannot argue for its existence at all. In order for you to concede that there are things, a world, a universe, a God, which exist, you must be you. You must possess an infinite and absolute self of your own, a consistent and singular frame of reference by which you can know that the truth is actually true, which means that it can only be true again if it is true to you. And therefore the absolute reference point of yourself, whether you find this consistent with your beliefs or not, must become the standard, the yardstick, by which anything you observe can be declared as true. You, in other words, are absolutely you, which means that truth cannot be absolutely true. It can only be relatively true insofar as it affirms the standard of truth, which again is you, your life, yourself, you, the individual, and that of others who can be observed to and that of others who can be observed to demonstrably exist as metaphysical and epistemological equals. So man and God, other man and God. The frame of reference of self is the only absolute standard of truth, which makes human life the only absolute truth, beyond which nothing man observes can have any relevant meaning or practical sensible definitions. Things cannot even be declared as existing at all, absent the conscious observation of man from the inexorable and infinite vantage point of self, meaning your self, your awareness, is the infinite, unmoving, absolute singularity of your existence. Your awareness is a prerequisite for anything being true. You are the immovable, absolute, infinite frame of reference for all you know. Therefore, if you concede a reality or an explanation of reality that demands that you are irrelevant, you can automatically disqualify that as false. Because since the only way you can say something is true or not is by the frame of reference of your awareness, your consciousness must be included as the primary root and nucleus of truth. So that's what I mean when I say the absolute vantage point of self. Your self never moves. Your awareness is that by which you know and can concede anything. So if you don't exist, meaning if you don't exist, nothing can be said to be true. Because the absolute frame of reference, the prerequisite for anything being true, is your awareness, my awareness, the individual. Thus and again, the movement of things you observe in the subsequent concepts you, or we as a human race, cooperatively create in order to categorize and organize this movement that we observe, the objects we observe, in order to categorize and organize this movement are only relatively true depending on how they agree with and affirm the standard of you, or self, the individual self, which is the truth at any and every given moment. The notion of absolute truth outside of absolute man presents us with an immovable impasse. How can two absolute truths coexist? Man concedes the absolute truth exists outside of him, thus he necessarily makes his own self totally besides the point when it comes to truth. You see, since man always functions from a place of absolute self, your essence of you, your metaphysical self, as indivisible and perpetual, but then turns and declares himself to be absolutely irrelevant to truth. Man cannot in actuality claim any truth outside of himself because his observation, being a direct function of his immutable self, is wholly unable to perceive this truth, which is absolutely outside of the absolute frame of reference of his self. If something is true outside of you, but you are necessary to observe it, then it can have nothing to do with you. Your observation is a function of you. Since absolute truth is true outside of you, then it exists beyond your observation. You can't observe truth. It's just one of the many proofs that this kind of notion that laws of nature or the determining rules of the universe or whatever are somehow the causal force upon man. This is thinking that isn't rationally consistent. So what he's really doing is conceding the unactuality of self when confronted with the objective truth. Man dies, you have to die so that absolute truth can be absolutely and infinitely true. Or your independent, autonomous, self-aware being or self is an affront to that absolute truth. So man must die, and if not, the emissaries of the objective truth tell us the truth dies. And then it's all just an orgy of sin and chaos, and God or nature or both will have to blow up everything and start over, meaning that if you don't sacrifice yourself to this standard, whatever, the standard of the collective, if you don't vote the right way, or you don't think the right way, or you don't die to yourself, you don't concede that there's a system out there in the universe that you need to fall into. If you continue in your irrational rebellion to think that somehow your thinking is independent of truth, that you are somehow an individual, then it'll be just an orgy of sin and the world will explode. This is why anarchists and atheists, it's all the same philosophy. It all results in the same thing. It's always about getting the individual to conform to a specific moral standard outside of himself. It's always about that. So the solution to this impasse would seem obvious after considering the aforementioned facts. There is no such thing as man conceding any absolute truth, because his observation is always tied to the infinite reference point of his self. There is no absolute external place beyond himself by which he can observe and know truth to be utterly true by definition. It's mutually exclusive to him, because it also, being absolute, cannot include man's external observation in the realm of its own absolute existence. So if the absolute truth is absolutely true, we are mutually exclusive of it. We can't observe it. It's out there somewhere. We can't possibly know it, so it makes no sense for us to argue about a truth that exists outside of the individual, because even if it did, since our frame of reference is always our individual self, we couldn't know it anyway. There is no other point outside the self of man's observation which man can declare as the reference point of truth. He is alone the reference point. He alone is the reference point. And since man is the reference point of self, likewise is, to the utter exclusion of all other reference points. This makes all external truths purely conceptual, purely abstract, purely a function of man's mind, and not some absolute force outside of him, which therefore must, being absolute, determine all things, including man and his mind, his thoughts, and the knowledge of his self, effectively removing man from existence altogether, making man a lie, as he must be nothing but a direct manifestation of the absolute and absolutely determining truth outside of him. Thus, insofar as you are aware of you, if you concede this, are obligated to deny this errant sense of yourself and allow yourself to be sacrificed to the absolute truth outside of you, because it is you, being absolutely absolute, and therefore it owns you, lest you present yourself as an immoral boundary to this infinite truth, which again claims an inherent right to your life as its own, to the utter denial of you in totality, which finds perfect moral fruition in your literal death, for death is the ultimate and most assured way to eradicate your consciousness, to eradicate and to placate your conscience, which can only ever serve to condemn you, but more importantly, condemn the truth, as it constantly lies to you and proclaims immorally and relentlessly the existence of the autonomous self of you. So your consciousness will continue to lie to you and tell you that you're actually an individual, that you actually are somebody. You are nothing. The individual, you, must be killed. This is most efficiently accomplished by literal death, but certainly self-sacrifice, sort of making yourself a cog in the machine, basically slavishly offering yourself and your property and your time to these standards outside of you will suffice. I mean, how many times has the church pastor stood up and demanded more money, more time, more free service? This is all in service to the same idea that your death, be it figurative or literal, is the bulwark of truth, which of course is madness and leads to all manner of moral atrocity, death, destruction, and horror. So thus this rebellion of your mind, your awareness, the delusion that you're an individual, represents the greatest evil of all and is the father of lies, making human consciousness the paramount violation of good, of truth. Okay? Let me say that again. The rebellion of your mind, your awareness, your individual self represents, the idea that you're an individual represents the greatest evil of all and is the father of lies, which makes human consciousness the paramount violation of good. And that's why you need to be aware that anybody who tells you that you need to believe in God because you're an extension of his sovereign will. You need to believe in atheism because the laws of physics are so rational, they're so causal, and you can't get around the truth. They're observable. We can know they are. We can know their causal power. You can't believe in God because the laws of physics are God. That's really what they're saying. They're just saying, the atheists are saying, don't believe in that God, believe in this God. But we're not going to call him God. We'll just call it the laws of physics. In order to be atheists, we just need to change the vocabulary a little bit and keep fundamental philosophy. And this basically is the philosophy of Calvinism, Protestantism, Catholicism, and all other collectivist ideologies, atheism, Marxism, fascism, tribalism, monarchism, all the collectivist ideologies, secular humanism, what have you. This is basically what they teach and preach, stripped bare and to the bone. And thank you guys for watching and for indulging me. And I really do appreciate it. And I'm going to sign off for now. Take care. Oh, boy, my face is really low. Here we go.